Hello again everyone, welcome to another episode where we dip in our knowledge and repertoire on Caro Kann. As usual, we'll peel everything off from both colors, so you can always use some patterns here in your own tournament. But remember in the previous episode we talked about pawn to c5, a sharp variation that leads to some chances for both sides to win the game. Today we'll still go through a Caro Kann that is not played a lot in top level plays that I believe can still give us a very dynamic play. And the move right here instead of the move pawn to c5 that we discussed in the previous episode is the move knight to e7. It looks slow, but the only goal in this position to bring a knight to e7 is to hope to bring this knight to d5 in the near future if possible. So for example, something like pawn to c4 already, we can just take the pawn on c4, and after let's say pawn takes, and so let's say pawn to c4 were to be played in this position, we can already take the pawn on c4, and after bishop takes on c4, we can just bring our knight to d7, where it comes to b6 next move, and also d5, or we could just bring our knight to d5 as quickly as possible. In any case, black's got some options. The tricky part is though if white does not move the pawn to c4 and instead just move the pawn to c3. This move solidifies the pawn on the center, d4 and e5, maintains the central control and also the kingside space. But in any case, for black here I'll just recommend playing knight to d7, continuing our plan to just break to the center of the board if you remember in the first video. But even here I'll just recommend black to just play knight to d7. The idea is still simple. If you remember our first video, we talked about black wanting to just break down the center of the board, move pawn to c5 as quickly as possible, and so you do not want to delay that. Now if you frequent database a lot, you'll see that black here most of the time plays knight to g6 and or pawn to h6. The next move will be something like bishop to h7 and then knight to g6. These few moves have been theory for so many years, but the problem is black is still deprived of so many spaces on the king side and does not have many players on the queen side. Most of the time, you'll see that white loses this kind of game because not only white has central control, the king side control, later on he'll also try to actually control the queen side where you cannot push pawns, and so you want to be careful in this position and not play into something like this. And so in this position, I'll just recommend something like knight to d7, where the idea is very clear to push the pawn to c5 the very next move. Now I think the question is, can white place pawn to b4, just stopping c5 at once, right? But remember, c5 is not the only plan that black has over here. The plan is to play on the queen side. So something like pawn to a5 I think is very nice already. Creating a counterplay, creating a attack, a hook so you say. So something like bishop to d2 from white already is nice for us because after pawn to b4, pawn to b4. Yeah, we may not have c5, but I think we can just, slow development with knight to g6. Later on, pawn to b6, pawn to c5, also very possible. In any case, white has overextended pawns right here that we can target. So pawn to b4, not something that white wants to play. And so in this position, normally you will see something like castle on the king side, or even something as simple as knight to d2. Now again, because this is a 64 square, there are a lot of possibilities. We'll just look at castle on the king side before we jump out to our variations. Now in this position where white castles, we stick to plan with pawn to c5, breaking out the center as quickly as possible. And even if white stubborns to defend with bishop to e3, we can just slowly maneuver this kind of thing. Slowly just castle on the queen side, on the king side if possible, and bring our pieces to the queen side like this. And so now if you wanted to, you can play pawn to a5, pawn to a4 next move to control the square here on b3, also a possibility. But the best move here for white is actually taking the pawn on c5, freeing up the d4 square for the knight to jump to, attacking the bishop here on f5. Obviously, you do not want to lose your bishop here on f5 because control is a long diagonal here, down to b1. Normally you bring your bishop back to g6. And it is right here that white can start throw everything at you just because he can, and because this is actually just a Caro Kann. Now before we proceed, what if white just plays a simple development again with knight to d2? Well, we just simple development again, which is knight to c6 right here, and say bishop to e7 will be next move, castle on the king's side. Slow play this. I think black has a very fine position, still a lot of possibilities. Black is very solid, but it is this move such as pawn to g4, starting to throw everything on the king side at you just because he can. A slightly difficult move to actually handle. Well, in this position I recommend pawn to h5 just to attack on the king side as well. There's no point waiting for the pawns to march out forward while you slow play and develop the pieces like this like normal. I think the best move to counter an attack is to attack. And the idea is after pawn to h5 we do not want to take because we do not have the firepower just yet. Instead we're just going to step back with bishop to h7. And look at what white has given to himself, an open g-file that we can use to control later on in the game. Not to mention if the king moves to h1, we'll always have bishop to e4 to control the whole diagonal as well. And so this is actually the benefit of keeping a bishop out of the pawn chain right here. So you can always have these kind of options. Now usually the best move for white in this position is knight to d2, just bringing the pieces here to the king side, just because you have a hole that I can always target. And let's say if we play knight to c6, he plays knight to f3, still we can just continue with bishop to e7. The point is white cannot just play pawn to h6 as he wishes to, because of the pawn take on h6 right here. We can see that we have an open g-file that we can use to attack the white king. I mean, how will white continue anyway? White can push on the queen side, but yeah, we can just ignore that. Queen to c7, you know, attacking the pawn twice right here. The bishop can come to f4, defending the e5 pawn twice as well. But then something as simple as pawn to g5, just breaking on the king side, should be easy. The point is you cannot take the pawn here on g5, because after the exchange right here, I think you're simply just breaking through on the center of the board. White just does not have the grasp anymore. And yes, in this position, you're probably not castling, but Caro Kann, in this position, even if your king is in the center of the board, this pawn here, the very typical structure of f7, e6, and d5 pawn, the center of the board, will mostly grant the king safety. Besides, who needs castling if your opponent's king is just very weak? We instead want to bring our forces to attack our opponent's king instead of worrying about our king's safety. And if white plays pawn to b4 here, I think it's already a mistake. Knight to e4 with the protection here from h7, and the knight here is on the center of the board, aiming at the king side as well. I think this position will be magnificent for black, if not winning. And black just has, in general, just a very easy way to develop rook to c8, for example, castle on the king side in the near future. In any case, I think black's position here is actually very playable. And the pawn here on h5 usually means nothing in this position and will die sooner or later. The other pawn push that you could play is pawn to h4. And this is quite clear, right? To play pawn to h5, trap the bishop. In this position, I think we easily just play pawn to h6, giving our square here for bishop. And in this position, white cannot just recklessly play pawn to g4, because we then have knight to c6, where we have attack on h4, let's say pawn to h5 even, bishop to h7. After pawn to f4, we can just jump in with our queen to h4, or we could jump in with our knight on e4, the same thing. And after king to g2, queen h4, yeah, we're just infiltrating. So even pushing pawns, white has to be careful in this position. In this position, it's very common for white to play bishop to e3, screening our knight here on c5. It is not protected, so we play knight to c6, bringing our knight to the center of the board and also just protecting our knight here with the bishop. Now attacking the pawn on e5 as well. You'll also notice something as pawn to h5 as possibility from white, but now we have bishop to h7 and bishop to b5. We have rook to c8, so on and so on. Black is not going to be worse right here. But I checked out some possibilities and I found that pawn to c4, just breaking the center of the board, is just very possible. The point is we don't want to take on e5 because if the pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5. Now we are the one with isolated pawn in the center of the board. Usually isolated pawn without the support of the other pawn from the adjacent square is much harder to defend if the isolated pawn is on the center of the board. Because now white can direct all these pieces to attack this isolated pawn right here. If anything, we're also giving white the flow of the game, so we don't want to do that. Instead, what we do is we take the pawn on c4, and even after knight to c6 and pawn to c6, yes, we have an isolated pawn on c6 and a7, but this pawn is on the queen side, it's not on the center of the board, it's somewhat easier to defend. Moreover, white does not have queen to c2 because the bishop is actually watching over it, and so it's hard to double that way. White can play bishop takes on c4, but after knight to d7, let's say attacking the pawn, the weak pawn right here on e5, white if he wants to can play pawn to f4, but then bishop to c5, trading off the strongest piece, one of the strongest piece rather from white is this bishop on e3, and so even after let's say bishop takes, knight takes, I think we're just fine. In any case, we got some play here on the queen side. We can take the pawn here on h4 as well. And even if you don't want to play knight to d7, we can always play something like queen take on h4. Taking the pawn on the king side is very nice. What else in this position? I think white can play knight to d2 or knight to a3. But even then, I think we can just play pawn to c3. For example, let's say knight to a3. We can just play pawn to c3, break up the pawn structure here. Let's say pawn takes on c3. Now we have, similar isolated pawn on the queen side, and rather symmetrical pawn structure on the king side as well. With the, if we're overextended e5 pawn, maybe not an issue in the long run if you can defend. But just one thing to keep in mind, because the knight here is already here on a3, we do not have queen takes on h4 because knight to b5 plans to fork here on c7. If we simply take on b5, bishop takes on b5 check, we don't have the d file ready for us to run to, and so e7 is the only square, and after bishop takes on c5, that is a very tragic checkmate right there. So please don't fall into that. Always look out for this double bishop checkmate yeah, very classy, very common, I should say. And the random knight move is more often than not helping for us, so you have to look out for that as well. But I will say this position is also very playable for black, with some pressure for white actually, because our bishop is cutting through this diagonal. Our rook can get into the b file, attacking the b file as well. The white rook cannot do the same thing because the rook coming to b1 will have meant a suicide, because the bishop is there staring at it. The other way to play is definitely pawn to f4. However, this move is less lethal than the other two, although it is the more common one to see. But then it's all the same thing again, we just develop a knight to c6, and after bishop to e3, let's say, we can just play knight to e4, and there are just tons of possibilities here for both sides. We can go bishop to c5, develop like that, we can castle on the king's side. In any case, black will still be very safe. There's no immediate pawn to f5 though. The pawn push to f4 is not really to push to f5, because again, you can take with both pieces really. The pawn here on e6, the bishop here on f5, both are fine. Rather, the pawn on f4 is just to protect the pawn here on e5. And it's possible to look for g4 in the near future as well. But even g4 right here, you know what to do. You can play queen to h4, you can play h5. I would like to play pawn to h5 myself because I like to open up the h file right here to the king's side. And if you just recklessly take, of course we do queen to h4. We don't care about this bishop because this is checkmate. And so yeah, a lot of possibilities and a lot of aggressive options for black to play for. Again, if white plays pawn to b4 from this side, from the queen side, we can just play knight to d7 back, still attacking e5, knight to c6 next move, bringing on forces to attack on e5, very possible. In any case, there's a flexibility around black's play right here. And I think with this line, we're just going to surprise our opponents more often than not, because again, this is not really a well-known territory, and because of that, I think it has more of a surprise value, and then we're taking the opponent out of a comfortable zone as well. I think this has to be a revolutionary move to play for Caro Kann advanced variation. Right, so this is about all the variation that I want to cover. Again, there are many nuances, and because I couldn't cover that within 10 to 15 minutes, I'm afraid most of us have to analyze this again in our own free time. But then the essence is there. I think you can already play some training games with this video alone and try to grind some patterns into your brain. But as usual, if you like this video, please press the like button and also share it with your friends if anything. It will mean a lot to me. Otherwise, thanks for watching. Bye bye.